I think the bang for the buck in the Biden packages is overall pretty good. These are critical investments for our economy, and we can debate the size and scope and approach that they take. But broadly speaking, these are areas that we should be spending more money on.
We don't want to waste $1 trillion that isn't going to have a high return. Every dollar that we spend, we either have to borrow or we have to raise taxes. And while I'm all for higher taxes on corporations and higher earners to pay for what we need, I'm not for higher taxes to pay for things we don't need. My name is Mark Goldwine, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
My name is Shai Akabis, and I'm the Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
So the first part of the President Biden's plan, American Rescue Plan, is actually already law. We passed it a couple months ago now, and that was mainly about COVID relief. There were other things in it, but it was getting a lot of money in people's wallets, extending unemployment, a lot of money for state and local government aid, and some additional money for vaccinations and general public health. The two remaining plans are really forward-looking. They're not focused on 2021. They're not even really focused so much on 2022. They're focused on making major investments in the economy, in the areas of infrastructure, in the areas of green technology, moving toward climate change, and in things like education and childcare. They also give a substantial amount more money to most households through greatly expanded tax credits, especially for parents. So these are big plans. If you add them together, we're talking about $6 trillion plus in new cash, paid for in part with big tax increases on corporations, big tax increases on higher earners, especially investors, and some borrowing that the administration hopes they'll be able to pay back over sort of a 15-year period.
The first thing that stands out to me is that it's a really bold blueprint. It really tries to tackle a lot of problems that the country has had, and it does it in a very significant way. It's not beating around the bushes or just working on these problems at the margins. It's really trying to get to the heart of those problems. Sure, there are people who propose even bolder approaches, but in terms of historical context, this plan, which is altogether about $6 trillion in new spending or tax breaks, is pretty significant in American history. It's been likened to the New Deal from the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. So we're talking about something that is pretty massive in its historical context. And a lot of these areas are important challenges that the country faces. So that's another thing that stands out to me, is that these are real problems that have been identified over time and that have remained unaddressed. So the administration is highlighting them, and I'll name a few. So child poverty is one that we know has plagued the United States for many years. Prior to COVID, about 14% of all children, more than 10 million children in the US, lived in poverty. That's really troubling for a nation that is among the wealthiest on the planet. So coming up with policies that can tackle that and reduce those numbers is critical. Another problem that we've had that this package tries to address is infrastructure. The administration will put several hundreds of billions of dollars towards not only traditional infrastructure like roads, bridges, tunnels, but also things like drinking water and innovation on the technological front. So research and development for things like semiconductors. Right now we have a semiconductor shortage in the US, and part of that is because our supply chains are coming from overseas. So all of these things are fundamental to the infrastructure of the country. They would also help on the climate front, which is another challenge that the administration has put forward in tackling. And transportation is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. So having greener technology deployed there will be helpful on that front as well. There's a few key questions that we need to ask when we're evaluating a package of this magnitude. The first is whether these changes are addressing real and important problems. On that front, I think the answer is yes. These are challenges that almost everybody agrees are impeding our economic growth and are adding to the inequalities that we have as a society. So on that mark, I think the president has really hit the spot. And another question that we should be asking is whether all the spending that is being allocated towards these areas is really necessary. In that regard, I think the answer is a little bit more mixed. In some areas, I think all of the resources that the administration is pushing for are really warranted. In other areas, it's maybe a little bit less clear. So one example is there was a lot of money that went as part of the American Rescue Plan, the first package that already passed, towards state and local governments. And we've seen that many of those state and local governments are actually in better fiscal condition than they were before the COVID crisis. So throwing a lot of additional resources towards those state and local governments is probably not the best use of those dollars for the federal government. A couple other questions we could ask are, will these changes be durable and have bipartisan support? On that count, I think it's also somewhat mixed. There are some areas where the president has really tried to put forward a package that could garner that kind of support. In other areas, it's less clear that that's the case. Maybe these are just opening offers and negotiations amongst the parties will lead to a solution that is durable. But especially where I sit at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we think that's really important, because if these changes are put into place just by one party and they don't have the support of a broader coalition, it's unlikely that they're going to be durable and sustained. So putting in place policies that have that type of support is really important. And then finally is the macroeconomic question, is whether these changes that the administration is calling for are so large that they stand the chance of overheating the economy and ultimately driving us back into a recession. There, the evidence is pretty mixed at the moment, and it's more of a wait and see question, and how the data comes in over the coming months as these additional packages are being considered. But it is a really important one, because we want to make sure that we have a type of growth that is sustainable and not one that is based on a sugar high where we're pouring too much money into the economy that ultimately leads to inflation, that leads to conditions where we get back into an economic downturn.
I think you really can't think of it as one plan or even as 10 plans, but I would try to minimum separate it between the American Rescue Plan, that was really about getting our economy back from the COVID recession, and the rest of it, which is really about the future economy. With the American Rescue Plan, the real question was it the appropriate size for the challenges the economy is facing, and was the money allocated appropriately to get our economy moving again? I think that the answer, frankly, is it was larger than needed. The good news is that's likely to lead to a faster recovery, an even faster recovery. The bad news is it's probably going to lead to some inflation along the way. We're even seeing some today, and means that some of the money is going to be, to some degree, wasted. It's going to be saved, or it's not going to spend as well. With the rest of the plan, again, there are so many elements to it, but I think a question is, where do we need to prioritize our investments to win the 21st century? Right? The theory in the last administration was we really need a competitive tax code. And there was something to that, right? And so they focused on tax reform, getting the corporate rate down. The theory of this administration is the opposite, is that what we really need is a competitive budget focused on new transportation infrastructure, replacing lead pipes, moving towards 100% or almost 100% clean energy and carbon-free, net carbon neutral emissions, investing in childcare. Investing in workers through paid family leave, education, pre-K, community college. Each of these things sound good in its face. A lot of them are really good and are going to help improve the economy. I also think that anytime you're going to spend another $4.5 trillion, you're probably going to spend a lot of it poorly. And frankly, there are areas in this package that they could be looking to scale back, to target better, or to ditch altogether. I think that the returns to things like pre-kindergarten and childcare are pretty well documented, and if we get kids in good childcare, that not only helps the parents to be able to work, which is hugely important for our economy, but it helps the kids throughout their lives. And so these are areas where I think investments make a lot of sense. On the other hand, as much as we do see crumbling infrastructure, I don't see a lot of evidence that we need to spend $2 trillion on roads, on rail, on buildings, on housing. There is a need, I think, for a larger federal role here. But a lot of this can be done in the private sector. And a lot of these projects are probably going to have pretty low return, because they're going to go to the politicians and they're going to say, well, what bridge do you want to build to get more votes? And the politicians are going to pick a bridge that nobody really goes on anyway. So I do think there's risks here that we're overspending in some places. I think there's risks around the paid family leave policy. I'm a big supporter of paid family leave. I'm also a big supporter of maximum flexibility between workers and employees. Not everybody wants to go away for 4 months or 3 months when they have a child. I know that when I had a kid, I took 2 weeks of complete leave, and then I gradually phased in over a 3-month period. That was better for me. It was better for my kid. It was better for my employer. It was better for my wife, frankly. And I do worry that the kind of government paid leave programs won't allow for that amount of flexibility. So I think there's places there we can scale back. Same within the higher ed space. A lot of these again are great ideas that are really worthwhile, but we need to think about how do we want to appropriately target them for our real needs, because we don't want to waste $1 trillion that isn't going to have a high return. Every dollar that we spend, we either have to borrow or we have to raise taxes.
I think the bang for the buck in the Biden packages is overall pretty good. These are critical investments for our economy, and we can debate the size and scope and approach that they take, but broadly speaking, these are areas that we should be spending more money on. When it comes to something like the infrastructure plan, the American Recovery Plan, as it's been dubbed, I think there are areas in there that probably could be calibrated a little bit better. We at the Bipartisan Policy Center put out a package that is about $1 trillion over the next 5 years, which is a little less than half of what the administration has put forward, and focuses on those core elements of infrastructure that have had bipartisan support in the past and that are really important for the American economy to pick up steam and be competitive internationally in the years ahead. So we also think that a revenue source for that should be user fees, things like the gas tax and other user fees from either companies or individuals that are using the items that we are investing in as a country. The gas tax hasn't been updated in many years. That seems like it should be a core component of funding the infrastructure needs that we have as a country, ultimately moving to something perhaps more like a vehicle miles traveled fee as cars are using less and less gasoline. But we need to make sure that it's not only corporations and the rich that are paying for the investments that are going to benefit all of society. Certainly those are the places that we can go to fund some of the needs, and they should be paying more than they are today. But we need this to be an everybody contributes situation where we're all invested in the future of the country's economic growth and in our overall competitiveness.
Look, some of the investments in the administration's proposal are going to, I think, have very high returns. Almost none, by the way, will pay for itself. There's this myth out there that if you spend money, it's going to pay for itself, just like tax cuts pay for themselves. There's not really a laugh for curve. Things like money for the IRS might, but investments we make in kids or investments we make in infrastructure, they'd have to have something like a 6-to-1 return in order to pay for themselves. Because remember, the federal government only taxes $1 out of every $5, and then you have sort of other effects. So none of this is going to pay for itself. Some of it, especially in the areas of childcare and early education, I think we're going to have very high returns. Some of the infrastructure, especially replacing lead pipes, well documented that when people have lead-painted lead pipes and kids get lead, it leads to health problems for their whole lives, lower IQ. And so I think things like replacing lead, also probably very high returns. Roads and bridges and rail, frankly, are not going to have high economic returns on average. There will be very high return projects, but a lot of this infrastructure will be lucky to get a 1-for-1 return. The Congressional Budget Office has looked at sort of generic infrastructure, and frankly, after you account for the borrowing to pay for it, they're not clear if it will even grow the economy at all on net. Because remember, if we borrow or if we raise taxes on capital, that's going to slow growth. And so the question is, do we get more boosting growth from the infrastructure than we lose from the taxes or borrowing? The Congressional Budget Office says that's not even clear for generic investments. So I think we should focus on where the highest returns are. Again, I really want to focus on lead because it is just so clear that if we can get rid of lead, it's going to improve people's lives for their entire lives and grow the economy. I think we really need to focus on childcare. That helps parents and it helps the kids. And I think we should need to focus on climate.
Well, thanks for that question. We want to help people across the country understand the tough decisions that go into making America's budget. That's both the spending decisions that we make and the taxing decisions. We often hear what people consider to be easy solutions to the federal budget, whether it's taxing the rich or cutting foreign aid or cutting waste and fraud. Those are not the types of fixes that are going to be of the size that are necessary to fix the federal budget. And the only way to really see that and understand that is to experience it firsthand. And that's what we've tried to do with the Balancing Act tool. It gives people a very simple depiction of what we're spending our resources on and how we're raising the revenues that we collect for the federal government. And if you want to make those two sides sustainable over time, they need to roughly match one another. It doesn't mean we need a balanced budget in every year, but we need to have a budget that is sustainable. So we've tried to create this tool, formulate it around that concept of sustainability, making changes on both the important spending programs that we have, as well as the revenue side of the budget, to get to a place where the budget is sustainable and we are meeting the needs of the country and doing so in a fiscally responsible manner that will allow for economic growth into the future.
I think that the idea that we need to pay for our investments is a really important one. Debt currently is the highest level as a share of GDP it has ever been, except for after World War II. By next year, we probably will be at a new record. We cannot afford to keep adding to the credit card. But this principle that we need to pay for what we want is really important. If something is worth having, it is worth paying for. Those folks out there that say, this is so important that we don't need to pay for it, have it exactly backwards. These things are important enough that we should be able to make the case for the higher taxes, make the case for, the reductions in healthcare spending, make the case for the pay-fors. And we need to start recognizing that budgeting is about trade-offs. And if these investments are worthwhile, they are worth paying for.